So welcome to another webinar from New York Theological Seminary, updating us on the COVID-19 pandemic. And we started these webinars with the medical view, right, with Dr. Lydell Letsam. He shared with us the medical side of this and the more scientific parts of what we needed to adjust to these changes. And as we are expanding these webinars, we're now trying to look at how different ministries and different ministers are doing ministry under these new conditions. And a few weeks ago, we had Dr. Charles Atkins talk about how that has changed prison ministry and his work as a prison chaplain. And now we are speaking with Dr. Mark C, who is a chaplain in the U.S. Army stationed in Germany right now. And he will give us a glimpse of what ministry is like under COVID-19 for the Army, for the military. So Mark, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks for having me, Tony. It's very interesting these days, right? With technology, it's good to connect.
I know.
Well, insofar as the Army is concerned, as soon as we knew that this was going to start hitting and impacting life as normal, from the religious support side of the house, what we looked at was how do we contain the spread of the virus, at the same time allowing people to continue to practice their religious rites and observances and services. So initially we had put out that groups could still worship, but in limited amounts, making sure that there was even spacing between people. This is before we knew a lot more about what was happening and how the contagion was being spread.
When did you start making those plans? Do you remember? Because this moved really fast, right?
It was really fast. And, one of the things that the Army is very good at, or military in general, right? We always have contingency plans. And we make plans or adjust plans as quickly as we need to. And we really looked at this as if we were in combat, actually. This is a combat. It's a combat against the virus, right? And how do we do religious support, particularly from our lane as chaplains? How do we provide religious support on the combat field as combat moves and things change and conditions change? So we initially began with what are the guidances, what are the limitations that are out there. So in fact, as soon as Italy was hit and Italy was beginning to have shutdowns, we were then watching and providing guidance to Italy. So our folks down in Italy were looking at, okay, how do we do ministry now? Do we go and shut everything down, or do we do limited amounts? Do we go open air? And the other thing that we looked at also was Korea, because South Korea was hit first. So we looked at how they managed their chapel services. So one of the contingencies we had initially was, okay, move all services outdoors, and also put technology into use so that we could live stream the services from the chapel into homes via Facebook, via other means, Zoom and other technological means out there. Then as things got even worse and we realized that having people in confined spaces is no longer viable, we then moved again, first of all, to outdoor services. And then when we realized that's even dangerous and we didn't know how fast and how widespread this could get, we disbanded all services and went to strictly streaming. So only the leaders could do it either from home or in the chapel. And we've gone to limiting no more than 2 people in the chapel or in any confined spaces and allowing them to be broadcast. So we moved very quickly in purchasing equipment, getting services to be able to live stream and or record and then broadcast broadly to all of the contingencies or the people who would be watching services. And then the other part of our religious support, we also talk about spiritual resilience, talk about all of the other factors that go into helping people stay resilient during these times.
Tell us more about the way that these things work, right? Because for those of us in the civilian world, and most of us were pastors, when this hit, most of us we were on our own, right? There was no denominational resources. Now there are, right? A lot of I think every denomination has had guidelines and resources to help, but when it first hit early March, nobody had any idea. And for those of us in New York, right, they were 1 week, they were talking about, New York is not going to be under the quarantine, it's not going to happen. And the next week, or less than a week later, it was, no, that's it, right? The quarantine was in effect, right? It was that fast. So churches and pastors, our students and alumni, they were left on their own to try to figure this out. Churches that had never done live streaming had to make the call on the spot, right? And a lot of time by themselves, right? But I imagine there's a more clear chain of command in the Army. How did this? Give us a glimpse of how that works, and how specifically how you mentioned that you're dealing with this as a war, right? A battle against a virus.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell when that shifted? Because I would imagine early on it was just a disease, right? It was another version of SARS, at least for me, right? It was another version of SARS, a more contagious version of the flu. I never imagined we would be, everybody would be working from home, national quarantine. I never imagined early on, right? So do you remember that shift, the mentality shift for you and for those you work with? And did that come from top down, right? Did somebody from the Department of Defense say, hey?
Yes and no. So both, it's the both and. Part of it is, we have a hierarchical structure, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of stuff that's been dictated down, and a lot of the information that was pushed out. So we call those like either policies or guidances. Mm-hmm. Policies are definite things you must follow, and guidance are suggestions, and then they can turn into policy. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that the military is really good at also, though, is not only pushing from top down, but is also about learning from what's happening out there in the field. So as information gets put into the system, then that gets floated up to the top. So we learn across from one another. Like I said earlier, like Korea was going through it first. So we were getting information from Korea. In fact, I called out to my friends in Korea and said, what are you guys doing about services? How are you guys collecting and offering? How is it impacting the number of people that are attending? How's it impacting the collections? And looking at what are the mitigating factors that are available. So we were getting cross information from Italy, from Korea, and then that gets fed up, and then also top down. One of the other things, as I mentioned, U.S. military is all about readiness. Mm-hmm. So we're always looking at what's happening around the globe, right? Mm-hmm. And we're ready for any kind of contingencies. Mm-hmm. And so we're looking at from all different factors. The medical folks in the military were tracking and seeing the rate of growth, right? Just the rate of growth. So we knew that this was coming. And so there were a lot of contingencies already in place for readiness. And at the same time, we didn't know how fast it would go. I mean, the rate at which it has gone. But we have contingency plans, like I said before. So we are able to adapt and move and make changes. So that's the kind of the interesting fluidity of our nature, of our organization, as big and bureaucratic as it is. Yeah. When headquarters at the Department of the Army pushes out an information or an order, that is sent out immediately, and within 24 hours, it's enacted. Mm-hmm. So, like, stop movement. I was on my way to Poland, actually, from Germany, and switching planes in Copenhagen, and they had delay upon delay. So I was in Copenhagen for about 7 hours. Then I got a phone call from our headquarters here, from our office, tells me, hey, where are you? I'm in Copenhagen. Get on the next flight back to Germany immediately. So I run to the counter, make my changes, and flew back, because by Friday that week, it was on Wednesday, by Friday that week, all movement orders to stop. Wow. So that's how fast we were moving in terms of reacting to what was happening. I don't think anybody really planned on how fast this thing moved, but we reacted, I think, as a whole, very well, very quickly.
Wow. in thinking about again, for those of us in civilian life, right? Tell us a bit about your average day before as an Army chaplain, and your average day. What does your average day look like now that you have to do everything?
Yeah,
Give
you
us a
know,
glimpse of
an
that.
average day for a regular chaplain, and that would depend on what level they're serving at. But at the very captain level, as a battalion chaplain, an average day would consist of about 85% of the time providing pastoral counseling and care to soldiers, visiting soldiers in the motor pool, in their barracks, in their workspaces, being available to talk to their soldiers about life issues. Sometimes it's very critical, other times it's just everyday things that people are having a bit of a difficult time trying to figure things out. At the higher levels, particularly as you move up to major and lieutenant colonel, and I'm a lieutenant colonel now, at our levels, depending on, again, where we are serving, but most of the job is about equipping and developing our battalion and brigade level chaplains so that they are resourced and developed and educated and trained to do the ministry that they're supposed to be able to do. Which includes all kinds of either financial resources, education and development, training, policies, directives. What I am specifically called to do here, especially, I'm a CPE certified educator, one of the few in the Army. And in Europe, I was called to provide CPE, extended unit of CPE throughout the European theater. From northeastern Baltics, all the way down to Italy and across just our area of operations. And the other thing that I was called to do is provide ways of developing and training our chaplains, our unit ministry teams on spiritual resilience. So I was making a lot of travel plans and developing a lot of training plans. And then all of a sudden, all that got disrupted, right? Like I said, I was on my way to Poland and I had to turn around. So now we're all looking at how do we provide what we do online? What are the resources online that are available? How do we push that out so that our chaplains, our folks that are stuck at home are able to pull those resources and help themselves spiritually while being restricted. And frankly, even our own office right now, we're splitting in our two teams, teleworking and being physically in the office because we still have some coverage to do. But most of it is just lots of emails, lots of teleconference and video conference these days.
Tell us more about spiritual resilience. You've mentioned that a few times. What does that mean for you and in the military? What is spiritual resilience?
Yeah, well, so resilience, that's a term that kind of gets thrown out there quite often. I personally don't like the word just resilience because that suggests to me coming back to where you were. But it's better than going back lower than where you started, right? So resilience to me is not only coming back to where you were, but hopefully through some of the struggles and through the ordeal that people go through, we learn to grow from that. And that's post-traumatic growth. But overall, spiritual resilience, it's really being able to dig into finding out how do we cope with what's happening, not just from a psychological, physical realm, but from a deep spiritual realm. What are some of the spiritual resources that are available to help us to find a new meaning and purpose for what's happening out there right now, to find the resources and the strength that is beyond us as people of faith. We return to God. What are some of the spiritual disciplines that help us to be grounded in God, to rest assured that despite all of the craziness right now and the uncertainty and the fear and the anxiety and all of that's happening, that God still is with us and walks with us. And God will help us get through this. So helping people to find those resources to get through, to find the strength and the spiritual power that comes from without, not within, but without, to tap into those things to help people to continue to be strong and hopefully eventually grow from the traumatic experiences that they're enduring now.
Yeah, yeah. In thinking about this, right, spiritual resilience and working with with soldiers, what are some differences before and after COVID-19, right, of the spiritual needs of soldiers and people in the military? Are there major differences?
It's really difficult to either quantify or qualify at this moment exactly what the differences are, because again, we're quite separated, right? Because we're not able to really get together. So what we're hearing is more anecdotal. What we're hearing from online chat and people that are communicating with us is really a couple things that are happening. Rise in anxiety, the uncertainty, the unknown, what's going to happen. And especially because of the stop movement right now, no one can go anywhere in terms of, particularly, there were people who were supposed to be moving. In the military, we call that PCS, permanent change of station. Now it's pushed out to the summer. And so we don't know exactly when people can go to their new duty station and other people come to this duty station. So a lot of uncertainty there, a lot of unknowns. So those are what's causing some of the anxiety. So we see that. On the flip side, we do hear a lot about people appreciating more family time, more alone time, more time to relax and catch up on things or find new habits or hobbies to improve themselves. There is also the fear of potential increase in domestic violence, because those who had relational issues and domestic violence issues right now are more confined. But we don't see those numbers yet because potential victims are not able to report those until after the fact. So the full ramifications of this, we probably won't know until afterwards.
Yeah. What were some of the biggest spiritual needs of thinking back in your time, right, when you were working a lot with the soldiers, when you're out, you know, on duty, on tour with them, right? Give us a sense of what were the spiritual needs, the greatest spiritual needs of the average personnel in the military, in the army.
Well, I'm thinking in twofold. One is those who have combat issues and those without combat issues. Right now, the greater number of our soldiers are still from that population who served in combat, whether they were directly involved in combat operations or not. The majority of us have deployed. And so I think the residual effects of those deployments, the impact it's had on the individual, on family systems, on the psyche and the spiritual well-being, I think we see still some of those things that are lingering. People who've lost friends, colleagues, people who've been injured, lost parts of their bodies. A lot of those psychological, emotional, and spiritual issues still are lingering. For those who have not yet deployed or have not had combat experiences, the typical things we see are issues of life, relationship issues, legal issues. Spiritually, they're dealing with what's the meaning and purpose, I think, at the end of it all. And what is the meaning and purpose? Why am I going through some of the difficulties that I am going through? For me as a theologian, it's always come down to the whole question of the theodicy. Where is God in the midst of all of this? And how am I supposed to make sense of it all? And for me, as a chaplain and a theologian, that's where I really engage with, I don't have the answers, but one thing I do know is as I am representing God, the very presence of God is with you and here and will work with you and walk with you through this darkness.
Have you found that you've developed a uniquely military type of theodicy? How long have you been in the army now?
I've been on active duty 15 years.
15.
Prior
Okay.
to that, I was 4 years with the Air National Guard.
Yeah. So would you say that in your time in this, especially the last 15 active duty years, right? Do you think that that you had a uniquely, because when I was talking to Charles Atkins, and he's been working in prisons for 20 some
Mm-hmm.
years, he said that his theology is now very much shaped, right, by his experiencing ministering to the incarcerated, and that everything he does, right, his entire worldview is shaped, right, by that. He's teaching the class this summer and in what he has called theology confined, right, and it's all about incarceration, and he wants to teach a church history class, uh, uh, church history confined, right, specifically about all the prisoners, all those who've been incarcerated, and how they advanced the cause of the kingdom, right, from Paul, who was a prisoner, all the way to King, prison, Mandela, right, and yeah. So do you think you've developed a uniquely military and army specific type of theodicy based on your experience, again, your deep experience of living and working and going into riding in those cars in Iraq with the soldiers, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I haven't reflected on whether my theology is specifically military oriented.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I am aware as you're talking, yes, I mean, I have been in this environment for 15 years. I've deployed twice to Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen a lot, felt a lot, and experienced a lot being with my soldiers, as well as being directly involved in some of the explosions and other things that were happening out there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, from a hermeneutic phenomenology aspect, yes, I mean, it's definitely, I am part of the phenomenology, and what's experienced by me is part and parcel of the theology that develops out of my experiences. So definitely, I would say it's impacted, but specifically, I'm not sure how my theodicy might be more military oriented versus just a theodicy in general. But I do know that the context in which I do think about theology and theodicy specifically have always been about combat and about soldiers. And in fact, even all my sermons, I mean, for the last few years, it's all about the combat experience and what my experiences are like as an Army chaplain. So yeah, it's I'm not sure if I've ever really thought of it specifically a military context or military centric theodicy, but yeah, it's got to be influenced by my experiences.
Yeah. Well, now is the time to think about it. You might have a book there. That might be your your book, your contribution to the world of theology. We skip this intro part. Tell us a bit about yourself. Give us a glimpse of who is Mark Lee, and how did you end up being
Well, I grew up in Hawaii. I was born in Korea, but moved over to the States very early on with my parents, and so Hawaii is home to me. After high school, I went to University of Southern California. Studied business, specifically international finance, with a minor in Chinese, thinking that I would be a multimillionaire one day. That never happened, of course. I went to work for the Bank of Hawaii, and then went to Los Angeles, Koreatown, and worked for a few Korean American banks there in Los Angeles. Then I went to work for Los Angeles Times, a newspaper. I was the financial analyst there, for not writing for the paper, but for the internal finances of Los Angeles Times. And I was getting my MBA at the University of Southern California. And I distinctly remember a very epiphanal moment at a church retreat where I felt a call to ministry. And after 2 years of discernment, I went off to Princeton Theological Seminary. Of course, that's where you and I met, and several of our friends. studied there, and then went back to Hawaii to be a pastor at a local church, United Church of Christ congregation in Honolulu. And at the same time, I joined the Air National Guard as a chaplain. And,
why did you do that at that time?
you know, I've always had this draw to the military. And of course, you know, I was wanting to go to the West Point. I didn't go. Then when I was in seminary, it's like, wow, the chaplaincy. Okay, well, that might be an opportunity to serve and be in uniform. That didn't work out until the day of my ordination. One of my best friends from high school, her dad was in the Air National Guard. He came to me at my ordination and said, Mark, you need to join. And I said, you know my history. That didn't work out before. It's not God's will. And he said, no, this is time. And lo and behold, the rest, as they say, is history. I actually went through the process and got into the Air National Guard. And a year after I joined the Air National Guard, no, not even a year, 6 months after I joined the Air National Guard, 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And it took me about 4 years to discern from that point on, about 3.5 years. I really felt very drawn, very called to join the active duty Army. I distinctly remember seeing pictures of chaplains out in the desert, ministering to soldiers in the war. And I remember praying, really need to be there. I really need to be there. I want to be there.
Wow.
And after a couple of years of discernment and convincing my wife that it was not a crazy thing to do, I signed up, went off, and 2 months after I graduated from the Army's basic course, I went off to Iraq for my first deployment.
What year was that?
That was 2005.
Okay. So things were still pretty rough.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then 2006, the surge happened. And I initially remember telling my wife, give me 3 years, just 3 years. And then afterwards, if you don't want it, I'll get out. And after my first deployment, it was rough. And I thought maybe I need to go back to the civilian sector. But you know, every time I looked at the civilian church, every time I looked at a church profile, and I came down to the same answer. It's like, no, that's not what I feel called to. And here I am 15 years later.
Wow. So, you know, so we've both had this exact same, almost exact same theological formation at Princeton. We got the same Masters of Divinity. And like most of us who get Masters of Divinity and then go into ministry, we always feel a bit of a disconnect, right, between the things we learn and the practical aspect of ministry, right? I mean, no shade to Princeton Seminary, but that's just true, right? What you learn, I think, in any degree, right? The things you learn in your MBA might not have been 100% practical in whatever job you took. But what if you could go back to our time in seminary, knowing where you are now, right? What would have been helpful to have learned more or taken more classes of in seminary to prepare you for the type of work that you're doing now, right? And I ask this partly because we are New York Theological Seminary, right? And we are hoping to form the faith and thought leaders for today and the future, right? So yeah, what would you tell somebody like me who helps to run a seminary that we should do?
Well, you and I have had some conversations about this, but I think two things very critical, and I will have to caveat that I am biased. So, but as a CPE educator and as one who has a PhD in practical theology, I would say that most seminaries these days are missing out because they're cutting their practical theology departments out or reducing them significantly. CPE was very, very crucial for me while in seminary to really start the journey of self-awareness. And then later on, as my experiences in the Army, both combat deployments, getting my DMIN and post-traumatic stress disorder and the role of spirituality, and then really wanting to from a practical theological perspective, what does faith have to do with helping people through the issues and the experiences of trauma? Because of my own experiences, because of the experiences of my soldiers, and so many chaplains and soldiers that I've seen around me who struggled with this issue of combat trauma. It just wasn't, I didn't have anything in my toolbox other than CPE to become more aware of the crap I was dealing with. But I had to go through therapy, I had to go through a lot of soul searching. And as a result of all of that, I realized that I wanted to know from a theological perspective, what is it about the church, what is it about theology that can equip people and equip us chaplains and ministers in general to be able to minister to people. And so I think that would be something that the theological education that's lacking right now is really the emphasis on trauma, theodicy, practical theology. How does theology get lived out in the praxis of ministry? And then in reflection, and this is a little bit of CPE, right? Action, reflection, action. You do the stuff, you reflect on it, and then you do it again in a different way from the new awareness that you have. That I think is very critical, but at least in our education, I don't think we got enough of that. We got some of it, but not enough.
No, and I, if you remember, I took my way out of CPE with my CPM, right? So I didn't even do CPE, which, you know, obviously I should have, I regret now that I should have done it, but I never did CPE. And I was talking to a few friends in talking about, about younger ministers, right? Younger pastors. A lot of them are automatically, they graduate, they go into ministry, and they have a therapist, right? They just know they need to get a therapist because the whole idea of self-care, right? And being self-aware, all of this, all these people in the 30s, right, are just so much better aware of that. Whereas I don't remember the term self-care at all when we were in seminary, right? I don't ever remember that term. We might have talked about the themes, right? But we never talked about, right? And then of course, from the cultural perspective, right? You know, you see a therapist if there's something wrong, right? Why would you go to the therapy when everything is fine, right? But obviously now that, you know, after 20 some years of ministry in real life, I get it, right? I get why it's necessary. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot, specifically to trauma and PTSD, right? So I think all of us are suffering through trauma right now, right? I think I share with you that to last count, there were about 9 people that I know who have died from COVID-19. 100% of them I've met since I moved to New York, right? And because I serve in a predominantly Black and brown institution, right? And African Americans and Hispanics are the people who the majority of the people who are dying of this. And that doesn't account for all the people who tested positive, who are battling it, those who are recovered, right? Last week we had a extremely sad case of one of our students. He was supposed to defend his 1 week before he defended his DMin dissertation, he passed away from COVID-19, right? Only his 50s. He was in his early 50s, an immigrant from, I think he was from Guatemala, right? Put himself through night school to get a BA, night school with us to get a MDiv, and then was getting his DMin. Everything was written, finished, right? He just had to show up to you know, he was going to defend it online because of what's happening, but yeah, I think exactly a week before he defended, right? So the, you know, obviously the faculty voted to still award him, you know, we'll give it to his family, and it was just extremely sad. And sitting through that vote, hearing the faculty talk about him, and then, you know, seeing his Facebook page with his This is a father, a husband, a pastor for many years, right? I never met this student, right? I work in administration, so I never met this guy, but I feel like I know him, right? The Central American immigrant pastor who works hard, provides for his family, puts himself through school because of the value of education. And I don't even know how to grieve for somebody I've never met. We're connected through a seminary. And that all of that is still sitting with me. And I think when all this is said and done, there is going to be some form of PTSD for all of us in who lived through this, but specifically for those of us who've lost people and who've had to make these radical changes. What can you tell us as a chaplain, right, and somebody with so much experience with a very different type of trauma, obviously, but still, nevertheless, dealing with treating people with PTSD. What should we look for in ourselves, right, to be prepared for whatever emotional and psychological uh, things that are coming for us? And as pastors, what should we look for, and what should we do to help our congregations and our communities?
Yeah, certainly. That's an extremely important question. Well, first of all, I hurt with you, and I am saddened at hearing this very tragic. I mean, all lives lost are tragic, but when this becomes that personal and that close to home, it's particularly difficult. One of the things that I think it's very important for everyone is to acknowledge that. I think a lot of times pastors especially, and I see this in soldiers all the time, it's push through it. Suck it up and drive on, as we say in the Army. Okay, this sucks, but suck it up and drive on. But you can only do that so much. Yes, there's an appropriate time to do that, especially when the mission at hand is, hey, we've got to keep pushing. But you can only push so much and ignore it for so long. So one of the things that, as time appropriate, one of the things that we need to be able to do is just simply say, this sucks, this hurts, and grieve. Express the emotions. One of the things that we do in the military, especially in combat operations, what I've done a lot of is debriefings. I gathered together the small group of people who have been impacted by the whatever issue was and situation, and I'll have a debriefing with them. It's a time to share with one another their own thoughts, feelings, what they saw, what they felt, what they thought, and what it's doing to them in the moment after the fact. That helps to normalize that you're not strange or different for feeling whatever you're feeling, that others in that situation are experiencing similar emotions, and that's an okay thing to do. So one would be to express it, two would be to gather together with other people who are in similar situation to process that together. So in CPE language, we would say to process the emotions, to share that and to debrief that with one another. And then later on, as more appropriate in terms of time and space, to gather then larger groups of people to talk about and commemorate and memorialize those who have been lost. And that's why, especially in the military, when we do memorial ceremonies, they're not really for the dead, nor are they for anybody else other than the people who are surviving. Those who are left behind, we're the ones that need to have some kind of sense of closure. We're the ones that need to process this. So we have ceremonies. Part of that is the ritual. So a lot of the things that are coming out of combat research, at least from my own research, is this, that in order for people to get through trauma, the healing process is some kind of a ritual process, some kind of a healing ceremony or service to kind of bring people together. As a marking of from one phase into the next phase, to help people process their grief and then move on to the next phase. So that would be very important. The other thing, as a part of all of this, the debriefing, the ceremonies, the rituals, to bring together the larger community, all of that really is all about community. To help people to remember that we're not alone, that they're not alone, that we all are in this together.
Mm-hmm.
And because really the essence of getting over trauma or growing from trauma, and from a particularly Christian theological perspective, is really the koinonia in the ecclesia. Why do we exist as a church? We know that the church is not just the buildings,
Mm-hmm.
but we know that the church is all about the people that are gathered together.
Yeah.
And in this time when we are not able to be physically together, it is so much more important for us to be connected even through electronic means like this, right? I'm in Germany, you're in Virginia right now, but we're connected. But when this is all over, so much more important for people to gather together and celebrate what has been now a successful recovery for many, and then to also memorialize and mourn those whom we've lost.
Yeah.
I think that in a larger sense, as the church, is so important to do later on.
Yeah, we've been talking about at New York Theological Seminary about doing a celebration of life memorial service when all this is over, and we want to celebrate the lives that we've lost, but also celebrate the people who are doing heroic things right now, right? All the people in the front line who continue to serve. And I just heard one of our students, she works with me, she's a work study student, she works with me, and her husband was tested positive last week because they kept their food pantry. They have a church and they have a food pantry, and they kept it open. They kept going because the community needed it so much, right? So many people have lost their jobs or they've been furloughed, and they kept going. And that's how he got it. He got it because they kept the food pantry going. And yeah, I think to lift up, right, people who are doing heroic things even in the midst of all these challenges. It's important to celebrate and to honor. What do you hope will come out of all of these? Any positive changes you hope will occur after all this is said and done, in the way that we do things, the way that we do ministry?
Yeah, I think, one of the things, at least personally, I'm longing to go back to church. I'm longing to worship in community. I think people who've maybe been marginal in church attendance or worshiping regularly might now yearn to go back. And yearn to be in community with one another. The other things that I see are just the overall sense of wanting to be with people, that whole desire to be in community with one another, to really commune with people. That families are close, healthy families, and maybe perhaps families who were a little bit shaky maybe become healthier. The other thing is I'm hopeful for maybe more teleworking so that the environment will be cleaner, less traffic, because we are stewards of the environment and we've been pretty bad at that. And maybe this is a good time for the earth to kind of heal.
Yeah.
And for us to recognize, hey, even if it's just a couple of days of, less commuting every week, maybe that's a good thing. So those are some of the things that I'm hopeful for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. This was extremely enlightening and helpful to me personally. And yeah, do you have any parting words?
Well, I just wish everyone health and safety. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of people that are out there still working and providing and caring for people. And that hits personally for me because I have a sister who's a nurse practitioner in Atlanta, Georgia. And she's frankly not sure if she's been exposed or not because of the lack of PPE at the hospital right now.
Yeah.
In fact, she was working on Easter Sunday. So I just pray for everyone out there that are bravely caring for medical staff, church workers, others who are out there caring for people. I just lift them all up in prayer.
All right. Yes, let's continue to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your time. Thank you for this. And thank you for all those who tune in to watch.
Yeah.
Stay safe, stay blessed.